Hi, welcome to the narrated PowerPoint for week 6, where we'll be talking about input, output, and interaction. So just a few announcements before we get started. Again, I apologize for canceling class. I just have no way of getting into the city because my train line has been suspended. A lot of down power lines and a lot of snow causing trouble. Anyway, so because of this, in lieu of class, I'm doing this narrated presentation. But to be fair, I think it's only fair to postpone the midterm quiz and the lit review, which would have been due in the next couple weeks. In a similar vein, the student presentation scheduled for tonight will be done next week, and so next week we might have two student presentations. But in the meantime, we should still feel free to interact with each other and to ask questions. So please use the discussion board to discuss this presentation. It'll count towards your discussion board requirement, and I think it'll benefit the whole class if you have questions about this slide or even anything that we've talked about before. So I'd like to start off this class by talking about Stephen Krashen. You've probably heard his name before. He was really highly influential in the mid to late 70s, going into the 80s, but actually he's really influential even now. I think many language teachers, especially in my generation and the generation before, have been highly influenced by his hypotheses. And so it'll give us a nice frame for us to examine some of the issues that he brought up and that others have brought up. He was almost like a rock star back then, and again, highly influential. And his hypotheses correspond with the advent of communicative approaches to language teaching, which we're all familiar with today. We all use in our language classes to this day. But as we'll discuss, Krashen's hypotheses have been severely and often justifiably criticized for being pseudoscientific and simplistic. In other words, for a scientific hypotheses are supposed to be unprovable. You're supposed to state them in a way that they can be disproved through evidence. And some of his hypotheses, as we'll discuss, can't be disproved like that. But his legacy is extremely important, if only for the way that he forced us as a field to deal with some of these fundamental issues and contradictions. And again, he helped set the research agenda even to this day. And so again, his hypotheses and theories will serve as a nice frame for us to discuss a lot of things going forward. So Stephen Krashen is most famous among SLA researchers because of his 5 hypotheses, which together constitute what we call the monitor model. And it consists of these 5 hypotheses, which we'll talk about in turn: the acquisition learning hypothesis, the natural order hypothesis, the monitor hypothesis, the input hypothesis, and the effective filter hypothesis. So the first of Krashen's hypotheses we'll be discussing is the acquisition learning hypothesis. So according to Krashen, second language learners have 2 distinct ways of developing knowledge of a second language. You might have heard this before in your other classes, but he made this distinction between acquisition and learning. So for him, these 2 different systems, this acquired system and the learned system, are separate, and the development of these systems takes place in 2 different ways. So these different ways of learning result in different types of knowledge. So if you develop your acquired system, that leads to what he calls acquired knowledge. And if you learn something, it leads to learned knowledge, which again are 2 separate things, and we'll discuss the differences in the next slide. So for Krashen, acquisition and learning are 2 sides of how people gain knowledge. You acquire knowledge implicitly, subconsciously, most likely in informal situations. So when you have this experience of just picking up a language through immersion and things like that, that's acquisition. And the result of acquisition is you get a grammatical feel of the language. You might not be able to explain why something's wrong or why it's correct, but you really get an intuitive feel for it. And acquisition depends, as we'll see, on the attitude and the affect of the student acquiring the language, and it follows a stable order of acquisition. Learning, on the other hand, is explicit and conscious. It usually takes place in formal situations like the classroom. And learning is things about knowing about a language. So the most typical way that you would think of learning is like learning grammatical rules in the classroom. And it depends on your learning aptitude, like not exactly intelligence, but maybe a certain kind of intelligence, like a language learning aptitude. And we usually learn, or things are usually presented to learners from a simple to complex order of learning. So Krashen's hypotheses, as you recall, were developed in the late 70s, early 80s. And if you recall, that was the time, at least in the mid-70s, when those morpheme acquisition studies were really in vogue and really a hot topic. So if you recall, Brown and then de Villiers did studies on L1 acquirers of English. And then later, Dulé and Burt did their morpheme studies on children L1 acquirers. And even Krashen himself, in Bailey, Madden, and Krashen, did a study on L2 adult acquirers. And what they all found, at least for those grammatical morphemes, is that there seemed to be a natural order of morpheme acquisition. And because of this, he posited that people, when they acquire a language, they acquire those rules in a predictable and natural order. Now, perhaps the most famous of Krashen's hypotheses is the input hypothesis, and that supplements the natural order hypothesis by explaining how learners acquire the knowledge and move from one point to another. In other words, we know that there's a sequence, an order of acquisition, if you will, but how do people move from one level to another or one point to another? How do they go from mastering the ing to mastering the plural s? And the input hypothesis explains how that's done. So the key to the input hypothesis is that learners acquire language by receiving comprehensible input. And he defines that as language heard or read that's slightly ahead of the learner's current knowledge. So you acquire something by receiving a message, a linguistic message that's slightly ahead. You understand most of it. There might be one or two things that is maybe above your current level of mastery. But you understand it with the help of extra linguistic info, things like the context of the situation or body language. So if you can think of your current state of your interlanguage as I, input at the I+1 level is what's required for acquisition. And that's what he would call comprehensible input. So again, this comprehensible input activates the language acquisition device. You can count Krashen as an innatist in this way. So for him, only comprehensible input at the I+1 level can alter a learner's grammar. Remember, it's only I+1 because in that way it's comprehensible. If it were I+2 or whatever, maybe it wouldn't be as comprehensible. So it needs to be comprehensible. You need to understand the meaning first. And he says that's similar to how kids learn their first language with the help of caretaker speech, like motherese or preschool teachers and things like that. And for him, speaking is a result of acquisition. So because acquisition is that kind of implicitly learned knowledge, it's readily available at any time that you can use for speaking. So once enough knowledge is built up through the input, then you can start speaking and using that acquired knowledge to produce output. So to summarize the input hypothesis, Krashen's main claim is that given input that's slightly beyond a learner's current level of grammatical knowledge, acquisition is automatic. In other words, and this is pretty important to realize, that according to the input hypothesis, comprehensible input at the I+1 level is both necessary and sufficient. Again, that's very important to realize that he thought that comprehensible input is both what you need for acquisition and all you need for acquisition. So remember that, because we'll be talking about the counterpoints later on. So again, for Krashen, comprehensible input is what's required and all you require for acquisition of a second language. Now you might ask yourself, well, what about learned knowledge then? Where does learned knowledge come in? And that's where he uses the term monitor. You can think of a monitor as some sort of executive functioning as a brain, a super ego, if you will. And it acts for planning, editing, and a correcting function, but only when 3 specific conditions are met. So learning for Krashen is separate from acquisition, remember, and your learned knowledge goes into your monitor. But in order for you to use your monitor, use your learned knowledge, you need these 3 specific conditions. And one is you have to have enough time to activate your monitor. For him, acquired knowledge is subconscious. You can employ it whenever you like, however you like, and you don't really need to think about it. It's almost automatic. But to use your learned knowledge, you need to have enough time to sort of recall and use it. So you need to have time first. Second, you need to focus on form. As you know, when we're communicating, we're usually, if not always, really primarily focused on the communication of meaning. But if you want to use your learned knowledge or use your monitor, you need to also focus on form a little bit. You need to divert a little bit of your, the attention in your mind to a focus on form, a focus on linguistic form, the structure of what you're saying. And the third condition, of course, is that you need to know the rule. You need to know those specific rules to use them. So again, learned knowledge is used through the monitor, but you need those 3 specific conditions. You need the time to do it, you need to devote a little bit of your attention to form, and you need to know the rule. Another well-known hypothesis of Krashen's is the effective filter hypothesis. And you might have heard the term effective filter thrown around a lot in your other classes or in your teaching practicums. And affect refers to things like feelings, like motivation, attitude, self-confidence, or anxiety. And for Krashen, affect explains why some second language learners are successful and others are not so successful given the same comprehensible input. So the effective filter subconsciously screens input and can block input, comprehensible input, from reaching your language acquisition device. And again, this determines what parts of language are paid attention to first, when acquisition efforts cease, and your speed of acquisition. So it even explains a phenomenon like fossilization and stabilization, where perhaps your effective filter is leading to fossilization. So here's just a funny picture of, illustration of the effective filter. So here you see somebody sitting at a desk, looking anxious and nervous, and the joke is the effective filter is up, so the person probably won't be able to learn much. So continuing with the effective filter, he said that the effective filter is really only operative in adults, and this explains why children have a better time acquiring language than adults do. And the effective filter accounts for individual variation in terms of language acquisition. So individuals with a high effective filter will be affected by it and will make language acquisition difficult, and those with a low effective filter will again have an easier time. So if the filter is on, or if it's high, the learner may understand the input. The input might still be comprehensible, but that input won't reach the LAD. It'll be, in fact, filtered by the feelings that that person is having. So as I said before, he said that comprehensible input was what you need and all you need. Well, he appended that by saying, well, that's as long as you have this low effective filter. So really what's required for acquisition is both comprehensible input and a low effective filter. So here's an illustration of the monitor model. So it sort of illustrates how he viewed how people produce linguistic output. So first you start off with your input. Of course, it has to be comprehensible. But that input is then put through the effective filter. So again, if you have a high effective filter, if you have high anxiety or low motivation, that input won't be able to reach your language acquisition device. But if the effective filter is low enough, then the input passes through that filter and reaches your language acquisition device, which leads to, again, acquired competence, again, learned implicitly. And then you can produce output from there. But again, where the learned knowledge comes in is through the monitor, as you see in D there. And the monitor acts then to sort of supplement your acquired competence, or monitor it, or self-correct, things like that. So you can use your learned knowledge through the monitor to produce output. But again, you need those three conditions to be met. And again, those conditions are you have to have enough time, you have to focus some of your attention to linguistic form, and you have to know the rule. So if those three conditions are met, you'll be able to use your monitor. Otherwise, you'll just have to use your acquired competence to produce your output. But that learned knowledge, that explicitly learned knowledge, is available to you through the use of the monitor if those conditions are met. So how did this monitor model influence pedagogy? Well, according to Crash and Terrell, their goal was to produce optimal monitor users, because that's what you can do for your students is provide that explicit information for them to use as their monitors. And they can use that to use their grammar as a supplement to whatever they've required in situations where that grammar knowledge is appropriate. But, and they say that this implies that grammar instruction has a limited role. Now, this idea has led to certain abuses of the monitor model, where there were some methods of language pedagogy back in the, back many years ago, where they sort of, since acquired knowledge is so much superior to learned knowledge because it's so readily available, there were a lot of efforts to just provide comprehensible input to students and not use grammar instruction, saying that, well, acquisition is what our goal should be, so let's just focus on that. And so that led to, a lot of pedagogies where there was no corrective feedback, or really no effort or input into output, for students to produce output. And again, it was abused in a lot of ways. You're probably too young to remember, but I remember back when I was a child, there would be these late night infomercials that were advertised like, listening to tapes while you sleep, and then that's how you would be able to acquire unconsciously a second language. Learn Italian while you sleep. But again, I don't even think Krashen would be in favor of something like that. Again, to sum up, the progress along this natural order of acquisition is achieved, according to Krashen's monitor model, through comprehensible input that contains structures at the I+1 level. And you can understand something at I+1 through the help of linguistic and extra-linguistic context, so through their prior knowledge of the world, and in a classroom by things such as pictures and explanations, which I'm sure we all use in our classrooms today. So as I said before, Krashen made a lot of contributions to the field of SLA. specifically this idea of explicit learning versus implicit learning, which is what we talk about today more than maybe acquisition versus learning. This distinction is still recognized today, and there's a lot of research around, how one leads to another, or if one can lead to the other. And comprehensible input as a necessary condition of language acquisition. Again, as I told you before, input is seen as necessary for all models and all theories of second language acquisition. And so he, again, put that at the forefront with his input hypothesis. He also highlighted the importance of meaning-based processing. That's what people do first, right, before they even pay attention to form. And we'll talk about that in subsequent weeks. And again, it spawned numerous research projects and took the field many steps forward. However, there were some problems with it as well. For Krashen, there was no interface between acquisition and learning, or acquired knowledge and learned knowledge. So for him, they were two independent systems of knowledge, and they didn't interact. So we'll call this the no interface position. So there's no interface or no relationship between explicitly learned knowledge and implicitly learned knowledge. They were acquired separately. And for example, explicitly learned knowledge can't be turned into implicit knowledge. There was just no way for that to happen. And again, that has problems of testability and falsifiability. There's no evidence showing that there are two separate kinds of knowledge and that they don't interact. Also, as we'll discuss in a little bit, there's no way really of determining what does I+1 really look like in the real world. It's fine to say that it has to be comprehensible and it can only be +1, but what does that look like in the real world? Like, what is this I+1? How do we determine that input is going to be I+1? And again, there was a diminished role of consciousness for the role of explicit teaching and learning in this model. Again, he, through the use of the monitor, it could be used, but for him, that was, not the best way of going about it. The best thing to do, of course, is to acquire language in a natural way. So just as we critiqued contrastive analysis and error analysis before, we can critique a lot of Krashen's hypotheses. So Greg had an article that argued that there were a lot of problems with the monitor model. And first of all, there's no evidence that adults have this specific language acquisition device without specifying what that device does. And that's a problem that I think a lot of models have that rely on this language acquisition device that's something in your mind specifically used for language acquisition, and that it's something separate from how you learn, like how to ride a bicycle or how to play a musical instrument. And again, Greg argues that there's no evidence that acquisition and learning are two separate systems that don't interact with each other, like Krashen claimed. And that learning cannot be turned into acquisition. In other words, something that you learned explicitly, isn't there a way to somehow turn that into implicit knowledge through, for example, practice? Some critiques of the natural order hypothesis we talked about a little bit last week. We found actually through research that some learners do differ in their acquisition orders, and maybe L1 does play a role, as we talked about last week. Also, we have this acquisition order for English morphemes, but what are orders for the vast other domains of language? We have orders for morphemes, we have sequences for things like question formation and negation, but what about everything else? What is this natural order for everything else? As for critiques on the monitor hypothesis, Greg asks, well, what if you only have learned knowledge? So let's take, for example, you're in a foreign language situation. Let's say you're in China, you're Japan, you don't have access to a lot of, other kinds of input except what you learn in the classroom. But there are plenty of examples of those types of learners being able to comprehend a second language in real time. And so, is the monitor only used for production, or can it be used for comprehension as well? As it seems it should be. And if it can be used for comprehension, that means that monitor can work sometimes, without those, conditions, or without that much time, that it can be done again in real time. And so there may be evidence there for this learned knowledge becoming more implicit, because they can be used in real time. As far as the input hypothesis is concerned, again, there's just need to refine and define what comprehensible input is. What's I plus 1? How is I plus 1 different from I plus 2 or I plus 10? What are these knowledge levels? And what's a sufficient quantity of input to move to the next level? If it happens naturally and effortlessly, through comprehensible input, well, how much input do you need? Do you just need, one reading or one conversation? How much do you need? Again, for Greg, there's a lack of or some questionable evidence to state that input is all you need. And that leads us finally to critiques of the effective filter hypothesis. According to Krashen, the filter works by filtering input, comprehensible input from the language acquisition device. But is that really how it works, that it filters input? Why does it recognize and screen out some grammatical structures and not others, right? Why would, let's say, anxiety or nervousness or low motivation filter out things on, let's say, acquiring, I don't know, the present perfect tense, but not the simple past tense? Is it because that you weren't motivated enough, or that your anxiety was too high? And is the effective filter really enough to account for the lack of success for second language learners? For him, as long as you have comprehensible input, you should be able to acquire the language. And if you don't, it's because your effective filter is too high, because that's the only thing blocking comprehensible input from your language acquisition device. But again, is that really enough to account for a lack of success? Is, your explanation to your coworker or colleague why they're having trouble learning that second language, you just need to, reduce or lower your effective filter, you're maybe too anxious, or you're not motivated enough, all those kind of things. Again, I think there's this critique of, is that really what's happening? Now, that isn't to say that we don't think that affect matters. I think everybody recognizes that things like motivation, attitudes, anxiety, all these kind of individual personal differences matter when it comes to language acquisition. But the question becomes, do those things function like an effective filter, or something else going on there? Again, I don't think there's anybody that denies that affective factors like anxiety and motivation have a large role in second language acquisition. But I think what they do question is if it works according to the effective filter, and that it serves to filter comprehensible input. So now let's broaden our perspective a little and look at input in general outside of Krashen's monitor model. So when we talk about input, let's think about the nature of the input that non-native speakers are usually exposed to. So we know that sometimes native speakers adjust their speech when talking to linguistically deficient interlocutors. Now, this isn't only second language learners, but also children. So you have the example of baby talk, motherese, caretaker speech, whatever you call it, child-directed speech that you probably whenever you talk to, let's say, toddlers. But there's also foreigner talk, which sometimes exhibits the same kind of features. So whenever you're talking to these linguistically deficient interlocutors, it contains some elements not found in your usual native speaker to native speaker interactions. So some of these features are like a slower speech rate than what's natural, maybe louder speech in some cases, long pauses, using more simple vocabulary like high frequency verbs, and maybe fewer idiomatic expressions or metaphoric speech. You have frequent repetitions and maybe less use of slang. So when speaking to an adult second language learner, sometimes you might refer to this as foreigner talk. So what kind of things do native speakers do when they talk to these foreigners? So some less obvious characteristics are things like you restate yourself a lot, and of course repeating the same thing over and over sometimes. Sometimes you elaborate on a response, you give more information that hopefully will aid comprehension. You may clarify grammatical elements, like adding or restating the subject. Like, it's this I'm talking about, we're talking about this, or, the auxiliary verb and everything like that. You might emphasize or clarify different things, and again, use short and simple sentences. And why do we do this? Well, first of all, because it's easier to understand for the second language learner, right? So input that's understood facilitates learning, although as we found even in the monitor model, it doesn't guarantee learning because of things like the effective filter or some other things that we'll talk about in future weeks. And some studies show that some kinds of foreigner talk is more comprehensible than others. So things like discourse elaboration and a modified conversational structure are more beneficial than linguistic modifications like simplifying your sentences or making it louder. I think something that I've seen and makes me laugh sometimes is when people speak louder to second language learners, thinking that's going to make it more comprehensible, when actually what they really need to do is explain themselves a little bit more. On the other side of the equation, what makes a language learner comprehensible to the native speaker? So what's important there? And first things that people might say is pronunciation matters and that grammar matters. But actually, these two are sometimes conflated in studies that we've done, where some native speakers aren't capable of differentiating between pronunciation and grammar. But when they judge the comprehensibility of a second language learner or a non-native speaker, they judge the native speaker, the non-native speaker, on both pronunciation and grammar, so that they work in conjunction. So even though in other words, it's hard to tell whether pronunciation matters more or grammaticality matters more. Sometimes the non-native speaker's lexical use is more of an impediment to comprehension. So sometimes the word choice that they use make it difficult. I don't know if you can think of some examples where maybe somebody was trying to say something, maybe they looked up in a dictionary and they found a word, but it just didn't make sense in real time when they were trying to use it. And again, the non-native speaker's ability to contextualize and link ideas coherently and correctly. In other words, to sort of make those logical connections in speech that we naturally do, but sometimes non-native speakers have problems doing that. So again, the determination of comprehensibility depends on a lot of factors. So some of the things that we do are, even with even between native speakers, are using back channel cues. Things when you say yeah or those things sort of move a conversation along. It indicates to the speaker that you understand what they're saying. But these cues have to be used correctly, so that it's really an indicator of comprehension. And so what I've attached to this this PowerPoint somewhere on Blackboard is a TV repair conversation. When you have a chance, or maybe you can pause this presentation and take a look at that handout that I usually give in class, and look at this TV repair conversation and how these back channel cues, these yeahs and uh-huhs, actually work against the non-native speaker in that conversation. So take a look at that. I think it's pretty funny. But also informative. Also, what determines comprehensibility is the native speaker's familiarity with non-native speech. I think most of us, because we have some experience with this, probably have a better we can comprehend a non-native speaker maybe more than the layman can, who doesn't really deal with non-native speakers that much. It's important to recognize that listeners always bring a set of world beliefs to any listening tasks, and they're aware of the situation, and sometimes these shared knowledge can overcome linguistic deficiencies. Like if you know what the situation is, you know what this person is most likely to be saying and communicating, then you can sort of fill in the gaps. While if you don't have a shared context, where you don't know what's more likely to be said or what the meaning's trying to be delivered, it may lead to things like interruptions, clarifications, and loss of communication and understanding. Again, I think that TV repair conversation handout is illustrative of that. So what we've really been talking about is these elements of interaction between native speakers and non-native speakers, or even among non-native speakers themselves. So again, this interaction requires usually a negotiation between the interlocutors when they question particular components. Wait, did you mean this? Or request clarification, or request conversational help, like, oh, sorry, I'm not following you, could you explain that again? Things like that we often do when we interact with other people and communicate. And this negotiation allows the conversation to proceed and allows speakers to maintain equal footing in a conversation. When I mean equal footing, it means like they're both on the same page, that they're understanding each other, that they know what each other are saying. And in non-native speaker interactions, this negotiation is probably more frequent than it is in native speaker conversations, and usually necessary to continue the conversation and move it along. So regarding non-native speaker interaction in particular, Long pointed out that these interactions involve forms that don't usually appear that frequently in native speaker to native speaker interactions. Things like comprehension checks, like do you understand me? Confirmation checks, like right, or clarification requests, or things like recasts, like that's a form of error correction. And native speakers ask different kind of questions of non-native speakers, and they often suggest answers. So they do a lot of repeating, rephrasing. They offer answers of questions that may not even be asked, because they're, again, negotiation, trying to anticipate and understand what the non-native speaker is trying to communicate. So again, this brings us to this relationship between comprehension and acquisition. And when I mean acquisition, I mean just language acquisition in general, not in the Krashen sense. So comprehending a native speaker utterance does not imply that the non-native speaker has learned or acquired the structures involved. They can understand it, but not learn or acquire anything. And comprehension tends to refer to a single event in the moment, while acquisition is a process that usually takes more than a single conversation or a single moment to happen. But comprehension can be seen as a crucial step in the processes of acquisition. And again, this brings us back to the input hypothesis. So again, earlier in this presentation, I supply these things that, again, Krashen, for him, comprehensible input was the key, right? And a lot of the things we've just been talking about aid in comprehension and aid in making input comprehensible. And again, Krashen thought that comprehensible input was what you need and all you need, or to be more precise, comprehensible input plus a low effective filter, right? So we've talked a lot about input so far, and as I said before, input was seen as essential for all theories of language acquisition. But the same really can't be said about output. So, for example, Krashen really didn't talk about the role of output in language acquisition because for him, it didn't really play a role. For him, again, comprehensible input plus the low affective filter was all you needed. The input hypothesis was challenged by Meryl Swain, who came up with the output hypothesis. And she claimed that input alone is insufficient for acquisition, or even input plus a low affective filter. She said that you can comprehend a lot of what's said or what you see or what you read without knowledge of the syntactical structure. In other words, all you really need is a little bit of vocabulary knowledge and some world knowledge, and you can figure out the rest. But that doesn't necessarily lead to acquisition. But she says that unlike input, where you really don't need to know this syntactical or grammatical knowledge, you do need that knowledge when you produce output. So output, again, this production of a language forces the learner to move from a semantic processing, in other words, thinking about meaning, to syntactic processing, in other words, thinking about linguistic form. And so she was a big proponent of comprehensible or pushed output as opposed to comprehensible input. So by pushing their output, learners are stretched in their production in order to make themselves understood. They modify, they restate, they try new forms. All these things, she says, is beneficial for acquisition. And a lot of the evidence that she gave when she put out the output hypothesis is evidence from immersion classrooms. And specifically, she was studying classrooms in Quebec, where they would have English and French instruction, and let's say these native speakers of English would be exposed to a lot of French in the classroom. They were given a lot of input, but not much output. And so, but even in these immersion settings, they could understand everything. They could get along, but they were still not really great when it came to writing or speaking. Like their output still suffered, even though they could take in everything. So the output hypothesis is important because it states that output it aids acquisition and not just a way to practice what you've already acquired or learned. So again, the role of output sort of changed with the output hypothesis. But how does it do that? Well, when you produce output, you can test out your hypotheses. You can receive feedback for verifying those hypotheses. It allows you to develop automaticity in the interlanguage. In other words, through practice, through output, you might be able to internalize something or maybe move it more into the implicit knowledge. And again, you shift from meaning-based processing to syntactic processing in other words, from meaning to linguistic form. And it shifts your attention, and that in itself will aid acquisition. So let's talk about these things in turn. So the first role of output that Swain posits is that output helps hypothesis testing. So she claims that through negotiation and through feedback, the stuff that we've just been talking about, learners can become aware of the hypotheses that they're using to create the language. So they form these hypotheses about grammar or the language in their mind, and through these conversations, they can become, well, what are these hypotheses, right? But not only that, the use of the language allows them to analyze it. And some of the evidence for this is like self-correction. And native speakers do this as well, but non-native speakers also do this a lot, where they might self-correct even in the middle of the utterance. And that may be evidence of this hypothesis testing. They may see that they try something out, they're not being understood, and they self-correct, they try something else. Of course, output also gives you the opportunity to receive feedback on your language. And of course, you can divide feedback into two broad types. So explicit feedback is when you explicitly state that there's a problem, like, I don't understand you, or that's wrong. And implicit feedback is that feedback that usually occurs during the course of an interaction where you get a funny look or somebody's not following you and you see, some body language. But this explicit, implicit kind of feedback can be seen as a continuum, right? There's some things that are explicit, there's some things that are implicit, and there are a lot of things that are in between. So for example, prompts versus clarification requests versus recast. These are different kinds of feedback that you might give your students. Like a prompt would be something like, what's the past tense form of that again? Or a clarification request is like, could you explain yourself? And a recast would be, if they say run, you'll just recast them ran. So continuing our discussion about feedback, we found that sometimes negative evidence may be a prerequisite for L2 adult language learning that you needed. And even if you recall the UG studies of the superset and subset, we found that out. And so in these UG parameter resetting studies, they indicate that positive evidence and indirect negative evidence may not be sufficient. You might need explicit negative evidence to tell you that you're wrong and that what you're doing isn't right. And this output and subsequent negotiation gives learners the chance to seek out this feedback or to without producing output. In other words, they don't get this chance for this feedback. And clarification requests have been shown to result in the greatest modifications of the non-native speaker output, although whether that can be generalized outside the classroom is still up for debate. And it's also important to note that the structural change in the mind of the learner may not be immediate, or it could just be a catalyst for change. So in other words, feedback is important, or it may be important, but you can't expect it to have immediate results. Sometimes it just starts the thought processes going on. So let's talk a little bit about recasts now. And we're talking about recasts because they found that recasts are actually the most common type of corrective feedback used in the language classroom. And especially in communicative language classrooms where you're afraid that any kind of more explicit kind of feedback will somehow produce more anxiety in the learner or interrupt their train of thought, things like that. And so we use them a lot in language classrooms. But even within recasts, there's a lot of different types of recasts. And if you're interested in studying this, there's been plenty of research previously done, but a lot of these questions are still up for debate. So to look at the types of recasts that you can give in class, one is this distinction between a partial versus a full recast. In other words, recasting is when you sort of repeat the utterance but in a correct form, right? But are you repeating just the incorrect part of it or the whole utterance? So for example, a partial recast would be, let's say the student says, I run to the store, and you say ran. Well, that's just a partial recast because you just corrected the word that was incorrect. But if you say I ran to the store yesterday, then you're recasting the full utterance. So that's partial versus full. Then a simple versus a complex recast is whether you just correct a single error or if you correct multiple errors. So let's say that there are two errors in an utterance. Do you just correct one of them or both of them? Also, you can think of it as focused and unfocused. In other words, I could say to my class, today students, I'm just going to correct you on the simple past tense, right? So I'm going to let other things slide, but today we're really going to focus on the simple past tense. Or, I could be teaching anything and I'll just correct any error I hear or see. And that's unfocused when you correct a lot of different types of errors. Sometimes recasts can be declarative versus interrogative. The tone that you give the recast in. Is it, you ran to the store, or is it you ran to the store? Just the tone may make a difference in how the learner perceives the feedback, and we'll talk about that in a little bit too. because that could indicate whether you're just confirming your utterance or you're asking for additional info. Maybe, again, the learner perceives those declarative versus interrogative in different ways. So again, since recasts are used so much in the language classroom, I'd like to share some of the research that's been done on them in the past. So Lightbound found that corrective feedback in the context of a communicative activity was more likely to lead to change than corrective feedback during audiolingual drills or pure practice activities. And I think this is an illustration of what others have called transfer appropriate processing. So the reason that corrective feedback is more effective when they're doing a communicative activity, when they're actually, when they're communicating something, and the importance of being understood is at the forefront, is because these are more like real life activities. So corrective feedback when they're doing something that's more similar to what they would do in real life is more effective because it's so similar. It transfers easily to other contexts. Whereas if you provide corrective feedback during an audiolingual drill or some pure practice activity where it's not as much, it's not very communicative, then those skills are harder to transfer to a real life situation. Lister Ranta also related the effectiveness of recast with uptake. In other words, you can recast all you want, but if the student doesn't notice it or internalize it in some way, if they don't uptake it, then that recast probably won't be very effective. And Lister also compared prompts. Prompts he defined as these clarification requests, repetition, giving metalinguistic clues like, oh, could you say that in the past tense, or is that the past tense, or elicitation. These kind of things are more effective than just recasts, he found in that study. Also, Han found that really for recasts to be optimally effective, they need these 4 factors, and one is individualized attention, consistent focus, so she's a proponent of focused as opposed to unfocused recasts. Also developmental readiness, the learner has to be ready to sort of learn that point. If they're not ready for it, it may not be as effective. And also intensity, so again, in other words, you have to maybe do it a couple times on that same grammar point, and it has to be intense enough for them to sort of notice everything and react to it and internalize it. There's some other research highlights I'd like to share with you as well. So Albert found that sometimes in a classroom, learners may or may not have the opportunity for uptake for the after the original speaker makes a comment. So here's an example where non-native speaker mispronounced flower, says clower tree instead of flower, and then the native speaker says a flower tree, and then goes on to say how tall is the trunk. Now see, by moving the conversation forward and asking how tall the trunk is, they sort of negate the opportunity for that non-native speaker to sort of react to it and to repeat flower tree correctly. Instead, the non-native speaker is more likely to respond to the question how tall the trunk is. Similarly, there's this idea of what learners perceive. So Lister found that there was often confusion between the corrective and approval function of recasts. And I've seen this a lot in classes that I've observed. So for example, a teacher might ask, where did you go yesterday? Or what did you do yesterday? And a student will say, for example, oh, I went to see a movie. And the teacher will repeat, oh, you went to see a movie. Now, when you repeat something like that, technically it could be perceived as a recast. But when you said that, you did it as an approval function, or just repeating what they're saying without actually correcting. And I tell my student teachers to take note of this, because I often hear them repeating utterances by students for no particular reason, or maybe they have their reasons. So for example, I hear a lot that you're repeating utterances to make sure that other students in the class can hear what that speaker said. But when you do things like that, when you do these recasts without a corrective function, then students get used to it. The students are used to you repeating whatever they're saying, if it has an error or not. And so that sort of diminishes the saliency of recasts when they do have a corrective function. So again, if they get used to you repeating whatever they're saying, then they may not notice as much when you're actually correcting something they're saying. They may just think that you're just repeating what they're saying, and they may not notice that there's a difference between what you say and what they say. Mackey also found that learners perceive lexical, phonological, and semantic corrective feedback. In other words, corrective feedback about using the wrong word or pronouncing the word incorrectly or just having a different meaning. They perceive that kind of feedback more than morphosyntactic corrective feedback. In other words, more than, say, verb endings or plural s, third person singular s. These kind of things are less noticeable than something that than correcting their pronunciation. So when you do recast, sometimes they think that you're correcting their pronunciation, and they may not notice that you're actually correcting their grammar as well. So let's go back to Swain's output hypothesis. We talked about how output could be used to test hypotheses. We talked about receiving feedback for verifying those hypotheses. And now let's talk about the last two, developing automaticity in the interlanguage and shifting from meaning-based processing to syntactic processing. So first, automaticity. According to information processing theory, and we'll talk a lot more about information processing next class, but I'll give you a little bit of a Cliff Notes version today. Learners have a limited processing system. In other words, there's only so much that somebody can process or think about at any given point in time. And there's a distinction between those things that you do that are deliberate, requiring a lot of time and working memory capacity, which is like, your working space that you have in your mind, and those that are automatic, involving less time and capacity. So you can think about, some things that you take a lot of time and care with, like, I don't know, putting together, a model airplane or something like that. It requires a lot of attention. And something that you don't really need to think about. Let's say, walking down a street on a clear and sunny day with no obstacles in your way. You don't really need to think about like putting one foot in front of another. So that's sort of the distinction of things that are more automatic and things that require more thinking and deliberation. And the idea is that when you practice something and you map things, you go over some things, you practice things, you can map grammar to certain output or to certain meanings, and that results in more automatic processing. And so here you see that there's a little bit of a distinction between what I'm stating here and what Krashen believed, where those, the implicit and explicit knowledge systems didn't interact. Here you see, well, when even if you have something that's more deliberate, at first, maybe through practice, you can make it more automatized and move it into your implicit system. And something that we talked about before briefly was, again, this idea of moving from semantic to syntactic processing. So just as there's a distinction between controlled and automatic processing, again, it's this limited processing system that we have in our minds. And again, humans, and we'll talk about this again more, process meaning first, and they do that on semantic processing, on semantic properties. But it doesn't provide an understanding of the linguistic system, because again, you're focused on meaning usually, and not on syntax and grammar. But when you produce things, the learner is forced to see the system grammatically rather than just through vocabulary or just meaning delivery alone. So when you produce output, you really have to think about how you're forming those utterances. So again, output forces the learner to move from semantic processing to syntactic processing. And then by doing this, again, through the feedback and everything, learners may notice a mismatch between what they produce in their output and what native speakers are giving them in the input. And then they are forced to reassess or restructure their system. So when we talked about input and output, I think where we're sort of going with all this is that, and we've talked about this earlier on in this presentation, was when you combine input and output, then it becomes interaction. And so we have the input hypothesis and the output hypothesis, but when you mix those two together, then suddenly you have interaction. And let's talk about that for a little bit. So again, with interaction, we've gone over the importance of input and then the importance of output. But then interaction, which is the combination of those two things, is seen to contribute to development because it's a means by which the learner can sort of crack the code. And we've talked about this in terms of feedback and things like that. The learner can infer what is said, in the input through those linguistic items that are not yet part of his competence. But when you use discourse to modify or supplement the linguistic knowledge, you're essentially making it I+1. In other words, even though the learner may not understand all the grammatical things that the input is providing them, but through interaction, through modifying, things like, clarification or repetition or these other discourse means that we talked about earlier to modify the input, then all of a sudden you make it comprehensible. And then they can then use that to supplement the linguistic knowledge that they can already use in their production. So in this way, interaction forms the basis of development of language rather than, again, just being a forum for practice. Again, output and interaction before may have just been seen as a way to practice what you've already learned, but the focus now is on that those two things are now the basis of development, the core of what helps acquisition. So just as before, we've had the input hypothesis, we've had the output hypothesis, and now we have the interaction hypothesis attributed to Michael Long. So for him, in interaction, we have things going on like negotiation for meaning. And that's just this negotiation work that triggers these interactional adjustments by the native speaker or the more competent interlocutor, could be a non-native speaker as well. And he says that it facilitates acquisition because, again, it connects input, the internal learning capacities, particularly selective attention. So again, this is putting it all together. So you have input, and then selective attention, which is, again, this information processing thing. We can't pay attention to meaning and form at the same time, or we're predisposed to meaning. So this sort of puts it all together. And output, again, in productive ways. So you're connecting it all together now. Input, selective attention, and output. And that all comes together in the interaction hypothesis. And so again, just as with output, this negative feedback obtained during negotiation work or elsewhere can be facilitative of second language development, at least for vocabulary, morphology, syntax, and even specifiable L1, L2 contrasts. In other words, you notice what's missing in your own interlanguage. So again, through this negotiation work, your attentional resources, which are limited and effortful, right, and normally oriented just towards meaning, can be then oriented to, through negotiation, to this discrepancy between what you know about the target language and what's required by the target language. And he calls that noticing the gap between what you know and what you need to know. And it also orients it to an area of the second language for which the learner may have little or no information. So again, they may not know what they need to know until they notice this gap. So this talk about interaction and everything that we talked about today brings us to a little segue between this class and next week's class, and that's the relationship between attention and memory and how that all facilitates language acquisition. And so for the interaction hypothesis to work, we have to assume that learners are paying attention, right? That they actually notice things, linguistically, I mean. And that negotiation requires attentiveness and involvement, right? It's a two-way street. You need to understand, you need to produce output that's comprehensible to your interlocutor, and then the whole interaction hypothesis comes into play. And what we'll be talking about next time is that there are claims that this attention is really the key to a lot of SLA attention and research, and that attention is what's really necessary for learning, that they have to notice things, and we'll talk about that next time. And Dowdy points out that not only must you pay attention to the input and output and everything that goes along with that, but you need to hold that information in memory somewhere to work with it. We call that working memory. You can think of it as a short-term memory, and we'll be talking about that more next time. But so not only do you have to notice and pay attention to some things, but you also have to process it in somewhere, and where that processing takes place is in this working memory. So all this is leading to meta-linguistic awareness, and meta-language is like language about language, right? So if you want to think about it in our teacher terms, it would be things like what's the subject of the sentence, what is the verb, what tense or aspect is the verb in. That's meta-language, and meta-linguistic awareness is awareness of these formal aspects of language. And so it's an ability to consider the language not just as a means of expressing ideas of communication with others, but also an object of inquiry, studying language by itself. And this is something that was sort of played down by Krashen and proponents of the input hypothesis, where they said that this metalinguistic awareness for them was just in the monitor. It can only be used, if you have those three conditions, the use of the monitor, and it would never transfer into the implicit system or acquired system. But here, you're seeing that that line is being blurred a little bit. So raising a learner's consciousness alerts him or her to differences in their speech and that of the native speakers. Again, this notion of noticing the gap, right? So the difference between what they're saying and what the native speakers are saying, they're beginning to become aware, and then through that, they can start to acquire linguistic features. And so, again, negotiation and feedback and interaction and output, those are ways to achieve this kind of metalinguistic awareness. And we're going to see that perhaps this will also help acquisition, and it's not just about the input. So that's it for this week's presentation. I know this is running a little bit long, but I'm giving you a little bit of a preview for next week as well. So again, if you need to go back to the first part of this presentation on stuff for next week, but continue to discuss any of these things in the discussion board on Blackboard, and I'll see you next week.